Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure on behalf of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to host a conversation this morning about the Oversight Board, a newly established independent content moderation body designed to decide whether Facebook and Instagram should allow or remove specific content. The board is comprised at the moment of 20 experts, academics, and former policymakers from around the world, although I understand it'll get up to 40 by the time it's fully staffed up. And its recommendations are binding on Facebook's decisions, unless implementing them could violate the law. The board also has the discretion to issue recommendations on the company's content policies. Cases for review are examined by a slate of 5 members. After a long run-up, the board has picked up the pace and it's rendered its first judgments on its initial slate of cases on January 28th. Most significantly, on January 21st, Facebook referred one of its most controversial decisions for review to the board. Did its suspension of former President Donald Trump's account for an indefinite period comply with the company's responsibilities to respect freedom of expression and human rights? In less than 90 days, we'll know the board's response. Given the gravity of what Facebook is asking the board to consider, it's vital to provide a firmer grasp of how the board operates, its review process, lessons learned so far, and of course, opportunities for the public to weigh in. Now, undoubtedly, the board is confronting some of the toughest issues out there. What's the line between distasteful speech and hate speech? Should political leaders be allowed to post even if they violate community standards? Who should decide what constitutes protected speech? We have a great panel today to help us unpack these questions and to preview what to expect from the review of Trump's Facebook suspension. The first person joining our panel is a co-chair of the Oversight Board, Helle Thorning-Schmidt. She's a former Prime Minister of Denmark and has also served as leader of the opposition party leader in the Danish Parliament, as well as a member of the European Parliament. Subsequently, she has served as a CEO of Save the Children, an NGO focused on the plight of children worldwide. And she has remained very engaged in geopolitical issues, serving as a member on several foreign policy think tanks, including the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, the European Council for Foreign Relations, and the International Crisis Group. It's a pleasure to have you join us today. Next, we are joined by Dex Hunter-Torricke, Head of Communications for the Oversight Board. Now, Dex has spent more than a decade working at the heart of the technology industry. He's managed communications for some of the most influential Silicon Valley leaders and corporations. From 2012 to 2016, he led the executive communications team at Facebook. He has also served as a personal speechwriter for Mark Zuckerberg. Subsequently, he joined SpaceX as their senior director of communications. It's a pleasure to have you here as well, Dex. And then finally, we're joined by David Kaye, who is not on the Oversight Board, but will serve as an outside commentator. He's a clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. His 2019 book, Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, explores how companies, governments, and activists are defining the rules for online expression. As a special rapporteur, Kaye was responsible for many landmark reports, including COVID-19 and freedom of expression implications, as well as a submission to the UN General Assembly on online hate speech. He has also published reports on AI and human rights, the global private surveillance industry, and the regulation of online content by internet companies. So without further ado, let's get on with the questions, but welcome all of you, and I look forward to a really robust discussion. Now, just for our viewers, we'll spend the first portion of the program engaging in questions and dialogue between the panelists. In the last 20 minutes of the panel, I'll open up the floor and take your questions submitted via the chat function. So please think about what you'd like to ask the panelists. There's no shortage of issues to discuss. The first question I want to start with Helle, the co-chair of the Oversight Board. And I want to start with a question regarding Facebook's referral to Trump ban. So this is coming at a really heightened political moment. It's happening. The beginning deliberations by the Oversight Board of this issue is happening while the second impeachment is occurring. And it's a really big test for the Oversight Board coming at a very early stage in its establishment. So I was hoping maybe you could enlighten us and tell us some of the considerations, the benefits and risks of taking on such a controversial and politicized case for the Oversight Board?
Great. First of all, fantastic to be here. Really welcome this kind of discussion. I also hope people listening in and being part of it will pose some questions, and I look forward to a lively debate. Before I answer your question, I think I might back up a little bit, because I think there are so many people who are not completely clear about how we're going to work with these cases. And basically the idea is that if a user is not happy with a decision that Facebook has taken on their content, either on Facebook or on Instagram, they first have to appeal to Facebook. If they're not happy with that, they can appeal to the Oversight Board. Obviously, we will not be able to look at all the cases. That goes without saying. We're already counting cases in the 10,000s and more. So we will pick the cases which are the most principal cases, which is of interest to a large number of people, and also the most difficult cases. A couple of weeks ago, we announced the decision of the first 5 cases. We will come with new cases very soon. And I'm very happy to talk about those cases, because they give a good example of what we'll do. Because first of all, we will take a decision in the cases. Of those 5 cases that we decided a couple of weeks ago, 4 of them we actually disagreed with Facebook's decisions, original decision, which means that they have to change their original decision. But perhaps equally important, we also gave some policy recommendations to Facebook, actually 9 policy recommendations. So that is how we're going to work. And I think many people have been asking, how are these guys actually going to work? What will it look like when they come out with a decision? But I invite everyone to look at our website. The way we have described the decisions, the way we have worded it is really good, because everyone can read it and follow it. And I really think that this will create a new conversation about content moderation. And now to your question, how we deal with this new and very high profile case. First of all, I'd like to say that we are happy that Facebook has decided to refer this case to us. This was exactly why we were created in the first place, to take decisions on the most difficult and principled content moderation decisions in this world. So it's just right that this case should come to us. We just started it, which means that we have given it to a 5-person panel to look at it first. And we have also now just opened for public comments, which basically means that anyone, organizations or private citizens who has got relevant comments for this case can send them to us. And of course, obviously the user or the user's administrators can send their comments to us as well. And this is the beginning of the case. We will look at this case as we look at any other case, which is a principled, transparent way of working, where we try to balance freedom of speech with other human rights, and where we also look especially to that this is an extremely prominent public figure, and has this person or this user got different rights than other users. So that is a task that Facebook has given us, and that's the task we have embarked on.
Great. Well, I think there's lots of follow-up to ask on that, but let me turn for a moment to Dex, and I want to follow up on a specific issue that Helle alluded to, which is that the full board is not going to be looking at this case. It'll be reviewed by a panel of 5. And, I think one of the questions institutionally that people have is, how are the 5 people selected? I know one of them has to be from the country of origin in terms of where the case is actually occurring. But in terms of the other 4, it seems a little unclear whether members can put themselves forward. Is it a completely random process in terms of who's selected? Does there need to be some sort of familiarity, with the circumstances of the case in order to be able to then render a decision? So any insight on that would be great as a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be here, Steve. One thing I think it's important to stress is decisions go before the entire board. So the panels have a very important part in the process. You're absolutely right. There are 5-person panels, and those rotate. They are selected randomly. There is a mix of gender representation in each of those panels. There's always at least one member on those panels from the region implicated in the content. But really, the panel makes a determination which is then shared before the entire board. And those decisions are signed off by the entire board. So there is a lot of focus naturally on who is sitting on each of these panels. But really, it's important to think of these decisions coming from the Oversight Board as a whole. And that's part of the reason, not the only reason, why we also don't share the identities of the members in those panels. There are other very important reasons why we don't do that. One of the big reasons is being security, and actually preventing members being unfairly targeted for their roles and decisions, and also making sure that members aren't unfairly lobbied about decisions in advance of those. But really, I think the panels rely on diversity and actually bringing together people with very different points of view, and then benefiting from the broader diversity of the entire board and all the different points of expertise we have on that.
Right. Great. Thank you. Let me turn to David for a second. And based initially in terms of what you've heard, obviously, this is a case of pretty strong import. It's coming before a board that is still getting its sea legs in terms of how it'll work, what type of precedent some of its rulings will have. And it's just, while it's released its first slate of cases, there's a lot that's unknown in terms of how this whole new process and structure will operate. What are some initial considerations that you think are important to be considered, both in terms of how the Oversight Board will review this specific case and its political import, but sort of more generally as they take up cases where there really are some high political issues at stake?
Right. Steve, first off, thank you for including me in this panel. It's really great to be with such experts and such respected people. I guess I want to start by backing up a little bit. The way I see the Oversight Board is it's a mechanism that's been created by Facebook in order to ensure that Facebook itself meets its responsibilities to mitigate or prevent human rights harms. And those could be human rights harms that are focused on freedom of expression, but they could also be focused on the kinds of harms that are about harassment, misogyny, the depriving of people of space to speak, and also the offline harms of violence. And clearly, the situation of Donald Trump's account raises all of those issues, right? It raises the questions of, was he deprived of his freedom of expression? Although a footnote here, my understanding is that it was his account, but it was also an account that had multiple administrators. And I do wonder what that means for how we think about him and his account as a speaker in the traditional sense. But it also goes to the other issues of the attacks on the Capitol, the attacks on American democracy, and how we think about those things. So the first thing I think of when I think of the Oversight Board is it actually serving this function of ensuring that Facebook isn't creating, causing, facilitating human rights harms? The second part of it is, and it's related to that, is that the Oversight Board, as I think as innovative a project as it is an expensive project. It's a project that is probably going to be difficult, if not impossible, to be replicated by other companies. Maybe YouTube and Google could do it. I'm not sure anyone else could. And it raises a question in terms of how we should take the decisions that come out of the Oversight Board. I think of the decisions as being very specific to the kind of platform that Facebook is. That means that the decisions should pay very close attention to the context of speech and the implications of speech on Facebook in particular. But I don't think that we should understand the Oversight Board, particularly in the context of the indefinite suspension of Donald Trump, or at least his account. I don't think we should take it as a statement about what other platforms must do or should do. It's not a statement, whatever the decision is, it could be a very helpful and interesting statement about how a company should observe international human rights law, but it's not a human rights body per se. So there are a lot of things going on here. And from my perspective, I'm going to be judging the outcome based on basically that fundamental question. Is the Oversight Board providing guidance to Facebook in terms of how it should protect, defend, promote human rights on that platform.
Great. Now that's a really important point. And I also think it's interesting too that you raised the issue that just because there is a decision made in terms of Facebook as a platform doesn't necessarily mean that that ought to apply to some of the other platforms. I would say that given how we saw the suspensions occur in sort of succession between Twitter, Facebook, and a rapid number of other platforms, my guess would be that the impact of this decision, whatever it is, will probably extend to other platforms and other technological means as well. But I guess we'll see how that relates. I want to go back to Helle and ask you a follow-up question. One of the issues that Facebook has asked the board to consider when it comes to the Trump ban, it really relates to the political leader question. And that's the issue. Should political leaders have a greater amount of discretion or be given a wider berth to say things, even if they violate community standards? And the answer up until the Trump suspension, for the most part, was yes, because of high public interest. In fact, Facebook called this its newsworthiness exception. Now it seems that we're sort of turning in another direction. But given as a former head of state, I'd welcome any insights that you would have on this particularly thorny issue. I think you may be on mute.
It's because someone was making noise in my building.
Now you're good.
I think they're off now, but if you have weird noise, then that's what it is. On the newsworthy question, I think there's definitely been, that is a guiding line for Facebook. It has been for many years and will have to be for us as well. Because at the same time as when someone is a public figure, it might be more newsworthy what they're saying, but at the same time, they will have to take more insults than an ordinary citizen being on Facebook and Instagram. And that's always been the balance that you have to strike. I want to go back a little bit about what is the purpose of the Oversight Board. And I want to underline that I'm not here to defend Facebook. I have no interest in Facebook. I don't care about their business model. I don't really care about Facebook. So my interest is not in Facebook. My interest is how do we actually find out where the balance is, what content you can have. And it's not only for Facebook. I think it will not only create precedents for the other decisions on Facebook and Instagram, but I also think it will have an impact on other platforms. And don't forget that we also envisage that if this is a success, other platforms, other tech companies are more than welcome to join and be part of the oversight that we will be able to provide. But that's a different story, and that's down the line. But apart from taking those kind of decisions, I think we will also be able to add other features to the debate around content moderation. Because until now, content moderation was basically done by the last person on Facebook or Twitter, as we have seen, either Mark Zuckerberg or the other platform directors. For the first time in history, we actually have content moderation being done outside one of the big social media platforms. And just that in itself is, I don't hesitate to call it historic. The other thing that we will be able to add is that for the first time, we have a true basis on how to discuss these issues. If you look at our decisions on our website, if you look at some of the public comments that have come in, this is the first time where everyone will have real access to debating these issues. For me, Facebook's decision has been a completely closed box until now. People didn't know why their content was taken down. They couldn't get a real decision, a real overview of what community standard they had overstepped. And of course, for users, it's extremely difficult to get in contact with anyone on Facebook. And they didn't know whether the content was moderated by an algorithm or by a human moderator. So for the first time, we actually have access to understand these content moderation decisions, and for the first time to debate them. So I think just in terms of transparency, our access to these decisions, and also giving Facebook policy recommendations, we will set a completely new standard to what we have until now. So I agree that we have to measure how this relates to human rights, but there are so many other things to be gained from this way of taking decisions, and that's why I joined. As I say, I don't owe Facebook anything. I joined because I think we need a much better, qualitatively much better discussion about these content decisions, because you can't just take everything down. You can't leave everything up. We have to find that fine balance, and we have to do that with much more transparency and much more engagement from the users and everyone else.
Great. No, I think that's, you raise a couple interesting aspects. I mean, I think first of all, you hit upon a really important point that there's so little that the broader public or even the community of experts know when it comes to some of the basic operations of Facebook's algorithms and this type of transparency that many have called for, including David in a number of his reports. And so I think even showing a little more about how that works and then being able to push in these policies is extremely important. At the same time, there's a lot of criticism that, by nature, the Oversight Board is a court. It's fairly closed in terms of how its decision-making is taking place. There's anonymity in terms of who actually is on the slate of judges to look at the case, and that it's comprised of leading experts without any question around the world, but that leading experts who also represent an elite perspective in terms of some of these decisions. And so I'm wondering, is that balance going to be difficult, and will that undermine some of the legitimacy that will come from what is arguably a very important step in terms of taking away decision-making for content out of the company itself and into an independent body? David, do you have a response to that question?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and Helle's points are also really, really important here. The way I see this, and I think the seriousness with which so far the Oversight Board has taken its decision-making role is I think to suggest that it sees itself in a way as a court-like entity, whether we want to call it a court or not. I mean, all of the things that have been said by my co-panelists have been emphasizing principles of independence, of expertise. I think all that is really quite important. We also need to reflect on the fact that there are limitations, and the Oversight Board is not the panacea for all the problems of online speech. It's far from it. It's very specific in, to use a court-like term, its jurisdiction. Its bylaws, its rules are basically allow for certain kinds of decisions to be taken around takedowns and so forth. I think it's very interesting that, as Helle mentioned, the Oversight Board is also making recommendations on policy. That's actually very useful and important. Those, again, apply only to Facebook. They don't apply to any other platform. But I think that's interesting. The broader problems that people see with social media, however, that go beyond content moderation, that go to the business model, that go to algorithmic recommendation systems, to all of that. I mean, it's certainly possible that those things will arise in the course of the Oversight Board's work. And I hope they don't shy away from that, even if the bylaws are unclear about whether they can or can't do that. But I do think we should look at the Oversight Board as I don't want to say narrow, because I do respect and applaud Facebook for creating this, to be honest. But I don't think we should put all of the responsibility for fixing Facebook onto the shoulders of the board and its panel members. I do think, though, that there are some serious issues, the kind that you're identifying, around anonymity of the judges and those participating in it. I get Dex's points about protecting that system. I guess I'm not as concerned about that as the Oversight Board seems to be. But I think those are some issues that don't go to the quality and expertise of the decisions themselves, but how those decisions are reflected in the public space, the credibility of them, the ability to engage with them. And that, I mean, I think over time we'll see how that plays out, but it's certainly a concern that I think people legitimately have.
I'd like to add to a little here, because I think there is a misunderstanding. We don't have any anonymity. I'm sitting here, I'm one of the co-chairs. I don't have any anonymity. Everyone can contact me. They can contact me on Instagram right after this call. There's no anonymity. And I don't know why you would be saying that there is. Because we are 20 members, it's completely public who we are, what our background are. Even my politics is completely public. And we have a five-member panel who prepares the cases for us, but it's the whole board that takes the decision. So I don't understand this notion of anonymity. So that's kind of the first thing. The other thing is we don't pretend to be everything Facebook. We cannot deal with how Facebook is taxed in where they operate. There'll be political regulation that is outside our remit. But I do think that everyone who criticizes this endeavor also needs to come up with an alternative. And I've been thinking about this because I've been working with this since October 2019. What would be the alternative? In my world, it would be much better if we had like a multilateral organization, the UN, for example, who could go in and do this oversight and to create an oversight board with independent members from all over the world. That would be cool. That would be the best way. I just don't think that's a feasible thing that cannot happen. And I really invite everyone who's critical around this oversight board to come up with a better solution, because for me it's much better than content decisions are taken outside the big flat platforms than ultimately by Mark Zuckerberg. So that's my invitation.
If I could I just want to make sure that it's clear, when I was talking about anonymity, I was reflecting on Dex's point that the names, the identities of the panel members on the specific case aren't known. I totally get that. In fact, I know many of the members of the board, and I even published something that was extremely positive about the makeup of the board. I was really only referring narrowly to the issue of the panelists. And also, to be clear, I wasn't necessarily criticizing that. I was just responding to the question about, how that might play into some of the credibility issues. But I think this last point is really important on alternatives. And I think this is where, as a matter of public policy, so moving away from simply looking at the oversight board, but looking to what do we expect policymakers, whether it's in the UN system or it's in governments or it's multi-stakeholder forums, what do we expect them to do? What do we as individuals or as citizens of our various nations deserve in terms of the kind of oversight that should be sort of placed over the entire industry, not just one company? And I think the points, there actually are some really great ideas out there. Article 19, the NGO based in London, has promoted this idea of social media councils as an example. And I think it's a great idea. I've promoted it myself. There are absolutely complications as to how one rolls out something like that for an industry that is global and has impacts in places around the world. But I guess my one concern, and this is truly not a criticism of the oversight board at all, but my one concern over the entire process and sort of the specialness of the oversight board is, will it, in a political and a regulatory sense, somehow suck up all the oxygen that might otherwise be necessary for multi-stakeholder and global processes to breathe? Again, that's not a criticism of the oversight board. It's just a reflection on the fact that, look, we're having this conversation. These kinds of conversations are happening all over the world. And I really don't want policymakers to be distracted from the fact that, notwithstanding the oversight board, we need regulation of this space that is governmental, that doesn't get into content, in my view, but is also multi-stakeholder. That is, it involves all the different actors who are implicated by social media.
Let me just put a, oh, please, Dex.
Sorry, Steve. Just to add on to what David said, I very, very strongly agree with this point. And I think, from the oversight board perspective, we have been super clear all along. We do not see ourselves in any way as a one-size-fits-all solution. Any meaningful solutions to these massive global problems is going to come through a whole patchwork of different things. Solutions from civil society, from the industry, and absolutely from government and international organizations. I think one of the things that is going to be a point of tension with some of the public debate out there on these issues is people are mad as hell about Facebook and about social media. Spend 3 seconds on Twitter and you'll just see the volume of commentary about these issues. And I think one of the interesting challenges is, over the last decade, largely because of social media, I think, people have got very limited attention spans for coming up with these very nuanced and complex solutions. People actually want a quick one-size-fits-all solution, and they want to know what is that one mechanism which will solve all of our problems. And the Oversight Board is not it. We have never claimed to be, we definitely don't see ourselves in that way. But a lot of people want to immediately dismiss the Oversight Board and look for something new. Well, I think the truth is any real solution is just going to have to involve a lot of different pieces of the puzzle being solved by very different actors, and all of us trying to work together and share our learnings so we figure this out.
Yeah, and if I could add, I think we're trying to find a solution on content moderation, which is not with governments. I mean, governments can't do content moderation. And I hear, I'm in Europe right now, and I hear so many of the European governments talking about that now they want to do something. But looking at just the borders of Europe, Belarus, Turkey, Ukraine, all those countries, every time something happens, Russia, of course, every time something happens, the first thing that governments do is to shut down social media. They don't want anyone to be in contact with each other. So we have to really have a deep conversation that it might work that governments are involved in content moderation in some countries, but I would say most countries in the world, it would be a disaster, because governments have very specific ideas of what is good, what is freedom of speech. And I could mention many countries where Facebook operates, where it would be very, very bad for people to have that imposed on them. So I do think we have to also be very clear that governments are not the best ones to do this content moderation, and we have to find something in between. I agree with Dex, we might have not found the perfect model for everything, but I do think it's a good place to start, because the way that content was moderated before, 2 weeks ago, was not good either.
No, I think you raise a really good point, especially in terms of the questionable record of many governments around the world in terms of getting them involved in content moderation. And so we're sort of stuck in a little bit in this difficult place where, on the one hand, I think relying solely on a private jurisdictional body raises questions, in terms of who makes ultimate decisions about appointing members, whether you're adequately getting in the voices of a larger diversity of stakeholders, as David alludes to. On the other hand, there is, very much a question of, negative government interference if they're allowed into the room for content moderation. And that actually brings up an interesting point that I think the Oversight Board is planning to take up in terms of two new cases related to India, where we're seeing right now in real time protests from farmers and questions about, I think it's more Twitter than Facebook, but Facebook, I'm sure, is implicated in this, but pushback from the government in terms of taking down tweets and hashtags and posts associated with that farmer rebellion. And so I understand that at least that there are several cases from India that the Oversight Board is planning to look into in the near future. Maybe Helle?
Yes, I don't know how much we will definitely look at cases from India. I say cases because I think there'll be a few cases from India. It's a very big country, lots of Facebook users out there. And also issues like what you're suggesting. I don't think I can go into it much further, but you'll see it on our website very soon.
Okay, good. Well, I was told. Oh, David, please.
No, I just wanted to say on this, it's a really interesting question, and And I think for people who are listening and who are new to the Oversight Board, and also new to how all of the companies do content moderation, I mean, your question really highlights that, the companies on the one hand have to moderate their own space according to their own rules, and they have community guidelines or rules and so forth, and standards and so forth, but they also are committed to observing local law, committed to observing national law. And that relationship between, say, Facebook and the government of India, when India demands the takedown of certain accounts, which is very much in the news with respect to Twitter, that's outside the purview of the Oversight Board. And yet, I do think, and I'm glad that you raised the question, because it remains a severe, and Helle's point, I think, was really well taken, which is governments remain extremely eager to clamp down on freedom of expression and public debate on the platforms. And there's nothing that the Oversight Board or any other outside board can do about it. There is something that governments, certainly government like Denmark, which is one of the leading freedom of expression governments in the world. I'm not just saying that because we're on a panel together. It's actually factually true. But other governments should be pushing for greater, or should say, less restriction from other governments at the same time as these other multi-stakeholder kinds of approaches might evolve.
Right. No, I think that's kind of where the balance and will sort of need to be struck. And I think why we're so interested in seeing how that will continue to evolve. Let me ask a question to Dex in terms of the kind of public engagement so far. So there's obviously been a lot of interest, especially in terms of the Trump ban, and there is one more day for public comments to be open. I'm going to start incorporating a few of the questions I've seen in the chat box, but one question we had, I believe, involved whether, to what extent how many public comments the board has received thus far when it comes to the Trump suspension case. Can you give us some general figures in terms of that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I just checked on the latest number this morning, and it's probably continued to grow just because a lot of them are coming in. I believe we've had around 9,000 comments so far. And if you look at the volume around the first set of cases, it was just over 100. I don't want to diminish that number because in that submission, there were some very quality comments. They really did inform multiple policy recommendations that came from the board. And we're incredibly grateful to all the civil society leaders and academics who took the time to prepare those really thoughtful submissions. This is an order of magnitude greater. So definitely there is a lot of work being done on the board side to read all of those comments and to go through them and to get all of the findings there that are relevant to making the decision. But certainly it's been a very impressive array of organizations all over the world who've submitted. And that's a key point as well. It's not just organizations in the US. Really, there are all sorts of actors and ordinary folks from around the world who have said, this is something that I care about.
Great. One question I have is that, so turning to the first slate of cases that were just adjudicated and decisions are out, one thing that I think a lot of us noticed, and I think this speaks to the independence part of the board, is that I think in 4 out of the 5 cases, the board recommended reversals for Facebook's decisions. And so, I'm curious about whether there's more to that, maybe Helle, that for you to highlight. Was that, deliberate? Was it just the nature of the cases that were chosen? And more importantly, what can we make in terms of the precedents, if there are precedents that will be built from in terms of the decisions that were rendered? Can these provide clues into where the Oversight Board may head in terms of its future decisions based on kind of its first pattern and decisions from its first set of cases?
Yes, I think we can. And again, I invite everyone to go and have a look at them, because it's actually really interesting, our decisions. And what I also want people to look at is our policy recommendations, and they're very sort of down to earth. One policy recommendation is that for certain parts of content, Facebook needs more human moderators to look at the content. We had a case with a Brazilian doctor who put up different photos of stages of breast cancer. Facebook decided to take it down. we were very convinced that Facebook had made an error. And when we pointed that out to Facebook, they tried to take it back. We said, no, you can't do that. Now we have to go through the process, and we have to make sure that we actually learn from this, so you can also learn that it's not always a good idea only to have the algorithm moderating the content. You actually need a human moderator. So that was one very clear recommendation, and I think that will create a huge difference. Don't forget, this was in October month, where there's focus on breast cancer, and this will actually create a precedent for the global community when they want to focus on that. Another interesting thing where we gave advice to Facebook was on their health information. It turned out, when we look at a specific case, that Facebook wasn't very clear on what how their community standards on health misinformation should be interpreted. So we advised Facebook, first of all, to get their house in order in terms of not only because they changed a lot over the last year for obvious reasons. So it hasn't actually been incorporated into the community standards. And we said to Facebook they should do that. But moreover, we also invited them, or asked them, or advised them to put this into a report, so we could see what is actually the community standard on health misinformation. And I could go on, because we have 9 different recommendations for Facebook. So look, I think the interesting is to look at the cases, but also look at the policy recommendations that we came up with. And I want to say one last thing, and then I'll stop, is that I wouldn't say that just because we disagreed with Facebook on 4 of the 5 cases that we decided on until now, that really proves our independence. It can't be right that we just have to disagree with Facebook, then everyone believes in our independence. They have to look at why we came to certain conclusions in the individual cases, and then find out, and then look at that. And of course, we are independent of Facebook. We will in many cases have policy recommendations, and I think we will show our independence, not only from being awkward and disagreeing with Facebook, but actually having a much more principled approach to these decisions.
Great, thank you. David, any initial reactions from the first slate of cases? Anything that either surprised you, that you thought good or bad, or something that you felt provides a little more insight into where the board may continue to kind of move as it takes on a greater number of these types of cases?
Yeah, I found them all very interesting and pretty rigorous in many respects. And I actually do think there's something important about the sort of saying to Facebook, you got this wrong. And I agree, it doesn't prove independence, but when you look at the way in which those decisions were made, I think they're very interesting. And I would just point to one point in particular, and that is, and I'm sorry, there was some reference to my reports in the decision, so thank you for doing that. But I think, putting aside the sort of self-promotion part of this comment, I think that the board was showing that it takes serious the idea that Facebook is a global platform, and that the Facebook rules themselves simply don't answer all these questions well enough, at least on their own, and that there's other standards, and that the global standards that one finds in international human rights law, which of course cannot be applied to Facebook as if Facebook is a state. It's not a state, it's a company. But those standards do provide a kind of set of principles that allow the company to see, and for the board to tell Facebook to see, that there are multiple kind of competing rights that are involved on the platform. Rights to freedom of expression on the one hand, which globally is a human right, but there's also the other rights we've talked about since the beginning of this conversation around physical autonomy, and democratic institutions, and so forth. So I think that there's actually a lot of interesting material in these early decisions, which, at least on the merits of those decisions, I think deserves to be taken very seriously.
Yeah.
But I thank you for having read through it, and of course we used your advice. But I want to say that it's so complex, because first of all we have to look at the community standards that Facebook have. they don't, as I said before, they're not actually completely clear on some of the issues, particularly new issues. Then also we run it through the international human rights law. And we accept that Facebook is, as you say, is not a country, but there's still certain standards that Facebook can live up to in international human rights law. So those are the two, those are part of our decision tree to get to a decision. And those are the discussions that will be so complex. And don't forget, our cases will be some of the most complex. We didn't always agree on these cases either, and that will be part of the way we take decisions as well, because we actually run it through these decisions, and Facebook has never done that themselves properly, at least. And for the first time, we will actually be doing that, and people can look over our shoulders to quite a large extent.
Great. Helle, let me ask you one point of clarification. So this is coming from one of the viewers who is watching this broadcast, and they want to clarify that the human rights standards, international human rights standards that are used, do not apply if they conflict with national law. Is that correct?
No, human rights standards, international human rights standards, they apply to everyone.
They apply to everyone. So that's a question.
No interpretation. They apply to everyone. Not like if a state, what a state has to follow, but companies and Facebook, they actually have to live up to international human rights law. So there's no, for us, that's not a contradiction. We don't actually look at national law when we look at cases.
Good, and I think that's something that can be a misunderstanding for a lot of people, because you can't assume that the national laws that are in every country are put forward in a way that conform to international human rights law and international law, and that goes to the problem of dictators and autocrats putting forth whatever types of laws they would like, and then sort of saying, well, this is national law, you must comply. So that's,
I think it's super important that Facebook might look at national law in countries where they want to operate. I'm not sure they comply always with national legislation. I think they try to come around it, but you have to ask Facebook that. But we don't have to.
Right.
We care about the community standards, and we care about international human rights law.
Right. Now, another question from a viewer is they want to clarify that policy recommendations are not binding on Facebook, right? So that Facebook doesn't have to do anything that you recommended policy-wise. It's merely you have persuasive authority on that, but it's not something that Facebook actually has to accept.
There is a distinction. Our decisions, Facebook have to follow those decisions. And that means, for example, the 4 cases we disagreed with Facebook, they will have to put that content up again. So that's one thing. On our recommendations, they have 30 days to reply. And they don't have to follow it. But I would also say that every year we're going to do a report on our work. And if Facebook hasn't followed any of our recommendations and not given good explanation for why they're not following our recommendations, I think that will put a question mark to the whole endeavor. So we'll see how Facebook reacts. They have 30 days to react now, and I would certainly expect Facebook to do their utmost to understand our recommendations and try to follow them.
And just to add to what Helle said, I mean, I don't think the policy recommendations, even though they're not binding, and that's clear, they are unimportant. This is the first time that Facebook has been required to show their thinking on these issues. They have to share how they are processing those recommendations. They have to seriously consider them as part of their policy-making processes, and they have to make public their response on these things. And again, these are things that Facebook has never been required to do because of the very opaque way that they've previously made decisions on these very consequential matters. So I think we look to see how Facebook will implement those policy recommendations. There are already early signs from this week with Facebook's new vaccine misinformation policy, that they are seriously considering those recommendations. But over the long term, understanding the pattern of thinking there and making Facebook say why they're not following our recommendations, I think is really valuable.
Right. And so that, and I think that's an important point, especially as we look towards the Trump ban, because, I can think of a couple policy recommendations that possibly could emanate, one of which is directly asked by Facebook itself, which is on the political leader question, where, depending upon how the board recommends, one hopes that this might actually affect future decision making in terms of what political leaders can or cannot say, on the platform. I think I also would wonder whether this is an opportunity, potentially, whether it's in that case or further on, to ask some questions about transparency when it comes to algorithms and what is disseminated in terms of certain types of speech or terms of certain types of inflammatory rhetoric, whether protected or not, to get a better understanding of what that distribution looks like and who actually sees what when it comes to news feeds. Again, I don't know how far afield the Oversight Board is able to go when it comes to these policy recommendations, or whether you feel bounded by a certain scope. But I think a lot of people would be curious how much you're willing to push that line.
Yeah. Do you want me to give it a go?
Please. Yes.
So yeah, I mean, first a few things about our scope. Right now, our scope is that we can look at cases from users where their content has been removed by Facebook. But our scope is going to expand over the coming months. So we will also be able to look at content that has not been removed by Facebook. The reason why that is a little bit more complex is because it takes a third party to actually complain about content that Facebook has left up. And a third party then had to complain, but the user is quite happy. The user's content has been left up, user is quite happy, but a third party had to complain. That will also be within our scope. The next thing that will also be in our scope is when Facebook shuts down a whole account. They do that sometimes, and until now, that's not been in our scope, but it will be. So that's the scope that we will end up having. That was the first thing. Then on algorithms, I mean, because our cases will work as case law, it will create a precedence in the future for other likely pieces of content and comparable persons who have put up that content. I think that over the years, Facebook will have to also change their algorithms, because it will also matter to us how much ranking, what ranking Facebook has given a particular piece of content. So that means if Facebook has a piece of content which is not permissible, just barely permissible, but they also decide to give it a very high ranking so that more people see it, then of course it will be more damaging, which we will obviously be able to comment on. So in the long run, our decisions will also have to impact their algorithm. This was an extremely complicated answer to a very simple question in my not mother tongue, but I hope that is clear. What I'm trying to say, that algorithms will actually also be impacted by our decisions in the long run.
Great.
I think this is extraordinarily interesting, and I think it goes to something that is common for the creation of any organization, and it may be that over time the Oversight Board sees its role, much as Helle just described, as it being essential to look into certain processes that Facebook engages in as part of its own content moderation, in order to answer the specific question in front of it. And so getting into those issues may actually involve doing things that Facebook itself, when it conceived of an oversight board, that it didn't originally think was going to be the process. And I think that's something that over time observers are going to need to watch. Like, to what extent does the oversight board grow and develop in a way almost its own sense of its jurisdiction, if I can put it that way, even though at the end of the day it's still it's a non-public response to problems of content moderation. That will be something I think very interesting to watch, and particularly watching it in the context of something like public figures, and the way in which we think about Donald Trump's account and public leaders all over the world. I mean, I think that one thing that will be very interesting to watch, not just in this initial decision, but perhaps as this arises in the future, is the extent to which the Oversight Board essentially says to Facebook, in order to do the contextual analysis that is really important if you're assessing, for example, incitement to violence, you're going to need to devote more resources to this problem in X, Y, and Z country or jurisdiction around the world. that's pretty interesting. That's a policy recommendation, but it's also a kind of impact that I think may go beyond what people might see as the four corners of the responsibility, the oversight board, but one that it sounds like I think will be open for it to take over time.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting to see how the board will evolve. And, you know, I do wonder that over time, whether it is even something that could take on more of a multi-stakeholder aspect, whether by proving and expanding its jurisdiction, it becomes a model for, you know, different creative ways to get at some of these tricky content moderation questions. So I guess we'll see. You know, one precedent question I want to ask. I know we're starting to run to our last few minutes. You know, circling back to the Trump ban and the issue of political leaders, is that I wonder if taking on this question when it comes to Trump is something that will then lead to a greater precedent in terms of looking at the speech, the potential incitement of other global leaders, including world leaders who haven't just lost an election. And so some of the leaders that have mentioned, whose content has been just to be diplomatic questionable, but Bolsonaro in Brazil, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, both of whom are still in power, and yet you could make a very strong case that what they have done, how they've used social media and Facebook, is equivalent to and has been equally bad in terms of what we saw from Trump. So are we opening the door to examining the conduct of other political leaders as well? Helle?
Well, we had a former Malaysian prime minister in the last case, which you can look up. So I do think political leaders will be part of our consideration. But I also want to calm ourselves a little bit now, because we go to this task with extreme modesty, and we are very humbled by the number of cases that we've seen, the 9,000 public comments. I hadn't heard the latest figures until Dex told us today. So we will take it case by case. And our principle for choosing these cases will be the same. They have to be of a principled nature. They have to be of interest to a lot of people. And of course, they will be difficult. So of course, there'll be political leaders, but it's not like we're targeting that right now. We have a very difficult case on our plate right now. Let's deal with that, and let's see the other cases. And I think we should be judged by years of work, not only a month of real deliberation and decision making, but by years of work where we will build up our cases and decisions, and let's just meet again and discuss them. Very
good. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so at this point, I want to sort of turn it over to final reflections before we conclude what's been a really fascinating conversation. I want to give each of you an opportunity to offer your any last perspectives. I don't know, we could go back to Helle or David if you want to go in initially right now, and then we'll just quickly.
Yeah. Like sure.
The last words. So first of all, thank you for hosting this conversation. It's been really interesting, and truthfully, we're all on a lot of Zoom calls and conferences these days, and this was exceptional. I think that I would say that as people think about the Oversight Board and do their evaluations of it, they should be, I think, yes, mindful of the humility that Helle was just talking about, and in a way that, at least at the outset, the limited framework that it has. But I think that people will need to stick with this story for a long time to see whether the approach that the Oversight Board takes, which the early suggestions are that it will be a serious approach, whether that approach is really embraced by Facebook, and also whether there's a possibility for expanding out from this example into civil society and multi-stakeholder approaches more generally around the world. And I think that that's something that I'll be looking to evaluate beyond the specific cases. And it sounds like that's what the Oversight Board members themselves are thinking about as well.
Great. Any last observations from Dex or Helle before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would say there is an extraordinary number of things on a daily basis that people are mad about Facebook for. And there are all sorts of giant challenges going on in the world. We are not going to be able to deal with all of those. The Oversight Board was not created to deal with all of those things. But I don't think we should count out the fact that we are doing a specific, very important thing. And this is a model that we're testing here to see if this is the kind of institution that can have an impact in one sphere of Facebook and the content moderation challenges they face. Over time, it is something that will absolutely evolve and grow. And as we build up our expertise and our body of experience in dealing with Facebook, I expect there will be more capabilities that come onto the board. So we are on a journey. It's not something that we necessarily know the final destination yet, but we are looking to test this model and refine it further. So definitely we're excited to share our progress on that as we go through it.
Very good. Helle, any last comments or?
Things first, online the humility that I talked about before, but also to all of those criticizing the Oversight Board and being doubtful whether this is a good idea and saying, oh, we should do this and we should have a bigger scope. I just hope that people will not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This, in my view, is the second best. We need to keep debating it like we're doing now. We need to keep making it better. But I think already now we've shown that our way of moderating content is better than what we had 2 weeks ago.
All right. Well, with that, thank you all again for participating. I certainly learned a lot. I thought it was a really great conversation, and all eyes will be watching the board in the coming weeks and months, as it renders some really important decisions for content moderation and generally for free speech. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.